Hey y'all, my name is Jonathan Wall, aspiring author and aspiring YouTuber, and welcome to Seeing What Sticks. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a plot device, or a catch, or a niche, or some sort of story hook, and we're going to kind of break it down into its elements um, and see if it works as a story device, as some sort of prevalent theme. Does it work in a narrative? Now, I'm going to be focusing mostly on a written narrative, more like a novel or possibly a short story because that's more what I'm familiar with. Movies have their own expectations, television has its own expectations, video games are obviously very interactive, so there's a little bit more that you can do with that. So I'm mostly focused on, written narrative, just a string of thoughts. Oh, quick disclaimer though. These ideas that I'm discussing on this show, today and hopefully in the future, are supposed to be as original and as from my own brain as I can possibly make them. Okay? I'm not trying to steal anyone's idea. I'm not trying to copycat anybody. So if anything I discuss is already like a book or a Netflix show or some big name movie, I'm honestly not trying to like piggyback off of that. I'm just unoriginal, not very creative, which doesn't help when you're writing a book, but we'll get to that later. So, today's topic, humans with tails. Does it stick? Well, let's see. So, I want to start with the world, the idea, the overarching world of the story, with human beings born with tails. Now, this could take many forms, and I really like this idea because it's very broad. Are we talking about humans born with, like, mammal tails, like a monkey's tail? Long, furry, flexible? Is it long and furry but rigid, more like a dog's tail? Or more like a kangaroo's tail, you know? Are we talking about a lizard's tail, which has scales? A fish tail, which has fins? Or maybe a tail that has like feathers, a chicken, a peacock, a an ostrich, some sort of bird tail. That could really depend, like that can really change the way that the world that we're looking at is formed, because most infrastructure and well, just about anything in human society is built around the human form. So you're talking about chairs that have holes in the back for the tails to fit through. You're talking about holes in the seats of couches, in the seats of cars. Automatic doors would probably close slower so that they don't catch someone's tail in them, you know? Or maybe more like a motion sensor to make sure that someone's tail crosses the threshold before it closes shut. Um, what else? We're talking about sports. If the tail is something functional, it adds to an athlete's performance. Are we talking about a fishtail where swimmers are now much faster, or a rock climber's you know performance based on having a tail that gives them extra grip, extra balance, or a runner's tail if they've got some long, rigid tail that allows them to lean forward and thus, kind of their tail sticks out and allows them to balance themselves, which is theoretically why a lot of like fast dinosaurs have long, rigid tails like the velociraptor. But I guess we're getting too sci-fi with all of it, but whatever. I mean, you've got to think about things like medicine. I mean, we have a medical field for just about every part of the human body: the eyes, the ears, the nose, the foot, the skin, your tongue, your teeth, your nails. Each piece of you has a medical physician, has its own specialist. So, of course, your tail is going to have its own physician. It's going to have its own doctor. So, now, what about clothing? Obviously, fashion is going to be a huge part in this world. We're going to have pants that have holes in the back, or perhaps unzip from the back or button from the back to allow the tail to stick through, or perhaps the back of the pants has an extra sleeve or an extra leg so that the tail can kind of come out a little bit. You're talking about tails that have kind of like sock coverings, almost like a leg warmer. You're talking about jewelry. You're talking about piercings. And speaking of piercings, and I'm about to go there, sex. You know, people are going to use those tails to have sex. We're not going to get into the details of that. Just go ahead and use your imagination. But if you're writing an erotic story, that is definitely something to keep in mind. I mean, I mean, think about policing. If you have a tail that is functional, that has utility, then police have to take that into account. When they handcuff your arms behind your head or behind your back, they might have to handcuff your tail as well. Now, we get into policing. Let's talk about discrimination. Let's talk about something like prejudice. You know, like racism. If we live in a world, or if our story takes place in a world where everyone's tail is different, has different types of tails, different styles, if you will, then it just adds another metric of discrimination. Just another. It adds another element to factor in when it comes to if somebody accepts you or not into their group. I mean, in the real world, in our actual world, we already have discrimination based on your skin color, based on the size of your nose, the size of your ears, the how your hair grows, the color of your hair, your body type, your your voice. And the tail is one of those things that adds an extra layer to that. Just another thing to point out and say, oh, we don't like you because of X. You know, or perhaps if you are somebody who is disabled or deformed, if your tail doesn't grow right, if it's not long enough, if it's too long, if it's broken at some point, you know, or severed, and you are what considered physically deformed based on the norm that exists. It's just one of those things that you can just spin in so many different ways, and it blows my mind the utility of such an idea. And I'm not even going to get into the whole into the chimera style tale. You know, the chimera in Greek mythology had the head of a lion, the head of a goat, and the tail was actually the head of a snake. A lot of people forget that the chimera's tail was its own head. It was actually a snake, you know, that moved around on its own from the back of the animal, which is really crazy. So we're not even going to get into sentient tails. We're just talking about, you know, extensions of the spine coming out your butt. Now, let's get into the main character, our MC. Is it possible to have a protagonist in such a world? Now, it really does depend on how widespread this whole tail situation is. Are we talking about just one person with a tail, the protagonist, in which case he may be considered a freak? Or we can flip it, and we have the entire world where people have tails and it's the norm. But our protagonist may not have a tail. He's born, or she, or they, them, are born without tails, which would still make them outcasts. They would make them distinct, but in a negative light. You know, could it be a coming of age story where tails don't develop until you hit puberty, and our protagonist is at that age, but their tail has not developed, and through their trials, through their struggles, their tail actually does develop, and it's a symbol of their growth as an individual, you know, as development into adulthood, which I think would be really interesting for the young adult category, the young adult genre of writing. Now, what about, you know, we discussed sports. What about a sort of Finding Nemo style situation where our character is deformed slightly? They have a tail that is supposed to be useful somehow, some way, but their tail is broken, misshapen, completely missing, and now they have to compete with other individuals who have fully functioning appendages, and they kind of come out on top. You know, a real underdog style story, which I think would be interesting. Um, what else? What else? What else? What else? What else? Is it possible that we're going to get a little bit into the sort of supporting characters as well? Is it possible that our protagonist has a rival? Is there an antagonist? Is there a villain to the story? You know, maybe our character is the only character with a tail, but the tail was given to them by the antagonist as a sort of like evil mad scientist sort of situation. And the mad scientist turned them into a freak, the tail being the most distinct portion of themselves, which, I mean, it's a sort of Dr. Frankenstein sort of situation, like, you made me into a monster. But, I mean, it's entirely doable. Or it could be a revenge story where the main character, our MC, gets their tail removed. It's taken from them by the antagonist, and the protagonist goes on a sort of rampage and um, goes on the hunt for the antagonist, for the villain. A sort of, reclaiming what was lost kind of story. Could there be benign supporting characters? Could there be friends or family members or, I don't know, romantic partners that follow our main character through their struggles with these sort of situations? Could we have more like a Romeo and Juliet style situation or story where people are born with different tales and they kind of keep themselves separated based on that? Because remember, Romeo was born into one family, Juliet was born into the opposite family, and the two were not allowed to wed because the two families were at war with each other. So, could you have that sort of situation? Our main character has got like a feathered tail. His love interest has, or her love interest has a lizard tail or a monkey tail, and it's a sort of forbidden love. Or do you just want to have like a gang war where you've got the kangaroo tails versus the freaking fish tails, and it's just that it's the most distinguished factor between the two. Obviously, you can have more dynamic issues between them. You can have some sort of rivalry that doesn't involve the tail, but that's the most distinct point. Just like rival gangs will wear, jackets or vests, or they'll have some sort of color coordination that would distinguish one from the other. Bloods and the Crips, Blues and the Reds, fluffy tail versus feathered tail, that sort of situation. Now, the real question here is, does this idea stick? Can we use this concept of human beings born with an extra appendage coming out their spine or extending from the spine? Can we use this as a plot device? I think so. I think there's a lot we can do with it. I think we can twist it and turn it as we need to, coil it like a piggy tail or a chameleon's tail to make it suit whatever story it is you're trying to tell. Because in fiction, often something that is obvious, like a tail or some sort of physical feature of the main character or any of the characters, is more reflective of the character's emotions, of the character's personality, you know? So, humans with tails. Does it stick? Let me know down in the comments. And if you have any creative ideas for a story or some sort of twist or plot device, let me know down in the comments as well as liking and subscribing. And who knows, maybe I'll mention you on my show next time. Alright, see y'all.